Hey, everybody. Welcome to this panel discussion with MFA alumni from Moore's Socially Engaged Art grad program. Really honored to be here with four great artists who have passed through the program and get to hear a little bit about their journey. And so this is an opportunity for them to share a little bit about, kind of their life and work before, during, and after the MFA program at Moore. I'm going to ask folks a couple of prompting questions and may kind of chime in if there's anything that needs clarification. But otherwise, we'll kind of hand off the floor to these artists to share. So we're going to start with Chelsey. And what I was hoping you could each go around and share is, your name, when you graduated, where you're at now, geographically, and also if there's anything that you remember about what you were doing when you decided to apply to grad school would be great to hear about. So I'll hand it over to you, Chelsey.
Great. As Daniel said, my name is Chelsey Webber-Brandis. I'm here representing the class of 2020. It was the most epic end of a graduate program experience maybe ever. But something that I remember about making the choice to apply to grad school was I was getting really into mural painting. And I was working with muralists like David Quinn, and I was going into schools in the Philadelphia area to do murals on the inside of the school and working with kids. And I just really fell in love with working in the community. And I fell in love with these strange aspects that were very surprising to me, like going to city council meetings to get permits and fundraising. It was very exciting stuff, but I became really interested in working with larger partnerships to make a big piece of something work. And so that was something that I wanted in a graduate program, is I wanted to hone skills that related to project management and grant writing. And that was something that I found at Moore. And I am coming, I forgot this question, I'm coming from New York City, which I'm sure that you can hear the sirens and the cars and things in the background. So hi, everybody.
Thanks, Chelsey. Okay, we're going to go in alphabetical order here and last name, so I'm going to hand it off to Tim.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tim Goldsmith, MFA class of 2019, coming to you live from Chattanooga, Tennessee. One of the things that, as I'm thinking about before grad school, I was making art and helping curate a multicultural art space here in town. And was kind of, as I was working through things, making my own work, working with other artists in their work, I was finding that I had questions that people around me were not able to answer. And I kind of got to a point where I was at the limit of my own skill set and realized that I needed to kind of remove myself from that space and get some more training. And so I started looking at grad school as an option. And none of the programs I was finding seemed to fit very well. And so then I started Googling made up MFAs that in my head, something that would make sense for me. And I Googled something like community art or whatever, and Moore was the first thing that popped up. And then I saw that they had, at the time, a summer symposium called In Out, which was dealing with different topics of community and socially engaged art. That year, it happened to be about the ethics of art, which is one of my favorite topics in art. And so I planned a trip to Philadelphia from Tennessee and went up and attended the conference and found myself in a room full of people asking the same questions that I was asking, and decided that I wanted to learn more. And that's how I ended up there.
Thanks, Tim. I'm going to hand it off to Qiaira now.
Hi, my name's Qiaira. I'm in Philly right now. Was plucked here from Chicago. I had just graduated undergrad and was just kind of floating around. I had worked for mural arts. I came to Philly for a teaching artist position and knew I wanted to keep doing that kind of like community art thing and didn't know where to foster that or where to find other people who are also trying to do that as a job somehow. And I think similar to Tim, I like had been Googling like community art things where I can talk to people and make the art stuff with people. And was Googling that when I was an undergrad. I was like, maybe I'll make my way to Philly somehow to hop in that program. And I did.
Very cool. Thanks, Qiaira. And Huewayne.
Hi, everybody. I'm Huewayne. I graduated from the Socially Engaged Art Program with the MFA in Community Practice in 2018. And I'll say I am now back in the New York City region. And I feel like I never really leave New York. It's just a sort of like, come and go. And so in that way, I had moved down from New York to Philadelphia around when I applied to the program. There had been a few years between finishing up a graduate program that was more social science or social sciences oriented and humanities oriented, but I felt like there was a piece missing. So for me, I started thinking about all of the art that I was immersed in, and then all of the community organizing work, formal and informal, that I participated in and was involved in. And so I was really kind of looking for more out of the work that I was doing. And so I applied to the MFA studio art program. And that did not play out. And I think it's just because, I needed to wait a bit, partly because here came this community practice, socially engaged art program that literally had everything that I was thinking and questioning and also doing already. And so it kind of felt great to be amongst and in the midst with people that were kind of, thinking about the same things and working through similar things. And I had been doing that primarily through my role as teacher and educator. And so always in the classroom, again, always engaged in dialogue, but then also always doing and making and putting together and answering questions, of course. So yeah, did I answer everything? I think that's it.
Yeah, you covered it. Thanks, Huewayne. And just for, both for anyone who's watching the recording, as well as, kind of a reminder for the folks on the call, since we have different, generations of MFA alumni here, is that, what Huewayne's referring to is that so about 10 years ago, there was an MFA in studio art program that was a low residency program. And so I think that was maybe the first time that Huewayne was describing, kind of encountering the program. And that was before my time. And it was run by, a great guy named Paul Hubbard, who's since retired. And then in the summer of 2015, we added these, and this is when I started at Moore, we added these MFA in community practice, MFA, as well as an MA program that was a one-year program. And then the year that Tim started, then a few years after, in 2017, we moved the program to be kind of on a more conventional academic schedule. So when I say low residency, I mean that it was happening primarily in the summertime and online. And then in 2017, we moved kind of on a more conventional semester schedule where folks were on campus more. And at that time, we also created essentially, what like Huewayne was describing, there was a MFA in community practice and an MFA in studio art. And what we decided to do was that it would serve the practices better, and it would kind of communicate more clearly the interrelatedness of aesthetics and politics, and the aesthetics and ethics, as Tim was referencing, that those things would come together in an MFA in socially engaged studio art. So I realize, that's all sounds a little bit convoluted when I lay it out in a 2-second version, but that's a little bit of kind of background behind the scenes stuff. I will not bore you with any more of the details, but that's a little bit of kind of context for folks. And so one of the things that really characterizes the program, sort of to move on to our next question, one of the things that characterizes the grad program, regardless of when you started or finished, is that people develop a thesis project. And as the four of you no doubt kind of can recall, that's sort of a multi faceted process that starts with a qualifying review where you ask a question, and that question is meant to guide your work kind of in the second half of the program, and that guides both your thesis writing as well as your making. And that, also sort of looks different for everyone involved. And so I would love to hear a little bit about what you did your thesis on. What was that question, or what did it ultimately end up being? And tell us a little bit about those projects. But also, if you have any advice for people who are in the program now about how they could pursue those projects, that would also be really invaluable, because, as this call demonstrates, sometimes we get the advantage of like hearing from the class right above us, but not necessarily always the people who were several years, in above us and have an opportunity to reflect on it. So with that said, thesis project, question about thesis projects and any advice for future MFAs. And I'll hand it off to you, Chelsey.
Yeah, thank you. So for my written thesis, I explored the application of trauma-informed practices gathered from the medical and social service fields to translate them to an art or education space with an emphasis on performance art and public and community art. And for my exhibition, I explored the Hahnemann Hospital closure. For those of you that aren't familiar, Hahnemann Hospital was a safety net facility that closed in September of 2019, just months before the pandemic broke out. And I was actually a patient of the hospital myself. And so I had this personal connection to it. And I wanted to explore the barriers to care that people that need to attend and receive services at a safety net facility experience when they're displaced and forced to go somewhere else. So the main work was I did the series of performances dressed in the hospital gown and socks that I received when I was last seen at the hospital. And I attached myself to an IV stand and I hung things from it. And I made zines and had pamphlets about, the public health crisis in America and all these things. And I took various forms of public transportation from the old hospital building to other safety net facilities in the area. And I did a couple of these performances before the pandemic broke out. And all of a sudden the work became hyper relevant, but it also became very stressful for me and for everyone around me. All of a sudden, like the visuals of these things, like a patient walking around the streets, like wandering attached to an IV stand, was just very different. It was very loaded. And so I decided to cease the performances and work with what I had. And unfortunately, because we were planning for an in-person thesis exhibition, a lot of the work was rendered just unusable in that format. And so I would say that my advice to people entering onto this journey and mission that we call Thesis is to really attempt to try and embed flexibility into your process. Yes, plan ahead and be structured, but like also kind of go with the flow because things happen with materials and the space or the worlds. And I would also say to really document everything as much as possible, because you don't know what's going to work and what's not. And a fail safe is to throw up some pictures and some documentation and really work with that. And also, it's just really nice to have documentation when you're working on a project or a performance. You get so hung up about the intricacies of it, and you just want to get it done and execute it properly. And then afterwards, you always want photos and you just kind of want to cherish that memory. So that's my advice.
Thanks, Chelsey. Tim, hand it off to you.
So my written thesis question/title was called Credit Where Credit is Due. I don't have to read it because it was long, because I love a long title. Greater care and visibility for collaborators and participants in community-based art. One of the things that I found from before I was in grad school, I was working with lots of people, collaborating, participating, facilitating, and artwork that I studied and saw, and culture and the community around me. You know, there's sometimes this like visionary artist who leads the charge, and then there's a bunch of people who kind of show up and do the work and then go home, and then there's no like that one person's the one with the paycheck and the title and the thing. And I was very confused about that. And so my question kind of drove me to research different practices of that. And I looked at why that, kind of the background of why that was. I looked at different art forms like theater, music, film, the ways that they kind of credit all of the participants and how that's visible. And then I did case studies on various artists such as Doris Salcedo, Santiago Sierra, Francis Alice, and different community projects that they did, and the ways that there was attention to the participants or lack thereof, and kind of tried to start working on a best practices for that, or start that. The thesis project, the work, was slightly disjointed from the thesis research, but there was a kind of bridge between them. I come also from a faith-based context, and so a lot of my art historically and currently still is tied to my faith and kind of that intersection. And one of the things that was happening simultaneous to being in Philadelphia in grad school was that the church that I was part of was going through a lot of kind of really messy public discourse with different topics and culture. And then Philadelphia being like one of the founding places of this country with all the historical documents, I was really fascinated with documents, legal documents, constitution, bills of rights, like all those kinds of things that are all around us in Philly. And I started digging into what that was for the church context that I came from. And so I did this large, and I'm going to share a screen so you can see an image, because it will not make any sense if I don't have an image with it. And I'm going to slideshow that. It had a much longer title, as I said, but I shortened it to this page, intentionally left blank. And so what I did was I took the constitutional document of the church that I grew up in, called the Book of Church Order of the Presbyterian Church in America, and I conducted a thoughtful kind of reading and intervention in the marginalia. Every page of the document was laser cut out of paper, so every word of the text was left intact, and then my own kind of engagement was conducted in invisible ink hidden on the page, and people were given black lights where they could kind of go around and search for the text and kind of see the text as it was and see kind of my question, my observation, my curiosity. And there was this recurring format of the legal, this page intentionally left blank, which I don't know if you can see with my mouse, that showed up many times. And so that was the space where I would conduct most of my intervention and most of my text and engagement and writing. And so it became this fun, like, click the light and see what you could find, but also this like legal document that I did not write, that hundreds of church leaders over a couple hundred years like would come together annually to write the text for. And so I wanted to make sure that was left as it was. And for me, that was the bridge about the visibility of contribution. Like, this was not my document. This was just me engaging the document. So I wanted the document to stand on its own and my engagement of it to be accessible, and present, but also that there was a space between those two things. And my advice is, as you are asking questions, particularly if you're starting your qualifying review, and this was advice that was given to me, and so I will pass it on, find a question that has the possibility of being generative for a long time, not just for a specific, just this project, just this thesis. Because the question I ended up with about like how to make the participants and contributors visible and to give credit is something that I'm still like doing in my work now. So come up with a question that you think will give you a lot to work with and not put you into something like minutely specific that you have no flexibility in.
Thanks, Tim. It's nice to see those install shots again after a while. So Qiaira, can I hand it off to you?
So the written part of my thesis was called How Tiffany Pollard Built the Internet, Representations of Simulacra, Virtuality, and Black Femme Identity on the Internet and its Art. I'm literally reading. I turned it into a zine. I'm literally reading the zine. And yeah, I just explored representations of Black women and femmes on the internet. And essentially was arguing that the internet is a really colonized space, and used examples of 3 Black femme artists who were kind of pushing up against that colonized internet digital space technology things. And then, like Tim, I guess my show process was a little bit disconnected, but like cousins of each other. And so for my thing that I showed, I was right after Chelsey. So class of 2021, we had the pandemic right in the middle. And so things shifted in a weird way, but I had a video project that I did where I essentially did a Google Maps road trip to my great grandma's hometown in Mississippi, and started at Chicago, where I'm from, or where my family migrated back to Mississippi, on Google Maps. And then the video was also intermixed with me making my great grandma's sweet potato pie recipe. And so for the actual installation part, I installed it in that window right in front of Moore, and the video was playing. And then the show part, I guess, was me and my friend had a dinner, just like in the middle, soul food dinner in the middle of the video, and people could watch it over Zoom. And so I guess my advice, similar to what Tim said, you have to remain really flexible. And I think being in the middle of a pandemic while also being in the middle of a grad program forced us to be incredibly flexible. All types of crazy stuff happened. And it really was important to document all of those things and how much they shifted and flowed. To this day, I look back at some of the documentation I did, and I'm really grateful. Not only because documentation is important, but also it helps me kind of see the thread between some stuff that I don't think connects and end up kind of making them connect when I look at all the crap I've done. And I think it's crap, but then it actually turns into a real thing if I look back at it. But yeah, the thesis part, I also would say the writing part feels really daunting and terrible sometimes. And the thing that made it kind of fun for me was to really embrace the question and why I thought of it and how I got there, and made the case studies really fun in relation to that. And yeah, a lot of parts of it really feel like they suck. And you have to work really hard to make them not suck. And that's just kind of, that's my advice.
And you turned it into a zine, Qiaira, right? Yeah. And you'd distributed that zine, right? I mean, you held up a copy, but
yes, it sold out, so that was cool. And then since I've done the zine and the what do we call it when we do the presentation about the thing you've written?
Oh, the oral defense.
Yeah, the oral defense. Yeah. Actually, since I dropped the zine, a lot of conference people have reached out to me, and essentially I did my final defense. I've been presenting that at conferences, so that's been kind of a cool thing that I didn't think would happen after grad school.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I'm not sure if you're looped in or not, but Qiaira referenced having this dinner party with her friend, and her friend Anima is coming into the MFA program in the fall.
Didn't know that. Shout out Anima.
Okay. I hand it off to Huewayne.
All right. So my written thesis title, I will read, African-American Definitions of Ancestor and Practices in Socially Engaged Art. So for me, it was very heavily research-based. Very heavily research-based. So I spent a lot of time in libraries and bibliographic sort of spaces, but it was very important for me to think about a genealogy of art and some of the extended and expansive sort of ways I worked at even a definition of art, and less so a definition of ancestor, right? That was a portion that I was researching. So I came in with into sort of, echo what everyone is saying, a really flexible sort of definition of art, and had a less focused sort of definition to work with of African-American ancestry. And so I started to comb through where I could find that in art and in some of institutional histories, and then thinking about Philadelphia specifically, in terms of it being a geographic location that is and has been for a very long time a major hub for the arts, and there was no way to escape the project. So I came to the question in many ways, right? And so I researched in a sort of biographical way the life and art of Anna Russell Jones, who attended Moore, graduated, is known or at least acknowledged as the first Black graduate, and as a Black woman graduating from an art school, art college in the 1920s. I was just curious, really. And so for me, it was about not trying to uncover what was there in terms of a life and an art practice, but to actually engage it through the sense of defining ancestor or ancestry. And that led me to a lot of archival work, but surprisingly, a lot of art historical work as well, and handling objects and documents and documentation in the very ways that we are all here as artists, talking through the importance of documentation, really being able to handle an artist who attended Moore from the 1920s, own their own documents and sketches and materials from their time they were in school, prizes, designs that they did. It provided the definition that I was looking for. And so I just needed to sort of test what was coming about through that definition in community and with community. And again, so being in Philadelphia, engage in Philadelphia's historic Black community, African-American community, historic institutions that extend out from those communities and are still extant, given, centuries of years, right? So I found the project to be really profound, but also a lot, and really at times too much. I'm being truly honest. It felt at times really abstract, and the only thing that grounded me, and I mean it, is happening upon a little piece of the Gorilla Girl exhibition where a librarian had wrote in, like, thank you so much for all of the work that you all do as, feminist artists, because, I research and I consider that an art and a practice. And, if there's any knowledge of the Gorilla Girls and what they're able to do with text and visual, and creating dialogue out of what may be laid down, right, for us to engage visually, but then also being able to generate the spaces, even as much as they're curated or not, the spaces that bring about those many definitions that we often sometimes look for or search for. And so that's how I came to the written thesis. And so I sort of, for the live thesis, I did sort of a presentation in many ways, right? There were documents, there was a book that included a chapter concerning Anna Russell Jones, but dealt with Moore's institutional history. There were photographs, or at least reproductions, right? But going through the process of, copyrights and fair use practices, all of that, that's important in arts, right? And still coming back to, I guess, what it means to have those spaces be spaces that can be curated, and known the challenges that even groups and tailleurs and workshops and people like Gorilla Girls experience. I'm just grateful for being able to get it done. And so I felt like it was a bit abstract, but fortunately it became an exhibition at the African American Museum through a lot of effort and a lot of support, and then became sort of its own thing, right? So something that folks wrote about in newspapers or news outlets, and so in that way it sort of moved away from me in a very personal sort of curiosity or even questions, and became actually a question and a project that communities of people could actually engage.
Thanks, Huewayne. And maybe we'll hear a little bit more about kind of where some stuff ended up, depending on what you decide to share sort of for our final go around. But it's really exciting to, think back about all the work you all did at that time, and grateful for the advice that you're offering folks. So my final question, and we're going to start, if it's all right, with Qiaira this time, and then move to Chelsey, because Qiaira's on a little bit of a time crunch, is if you could just share one project that you've done since grad school, and give us any context that might be helpful for understanding kind of how this lived in the world. And if it's not a project, it might be a job or an event or a workshop or a presentation. You decide the kind of parameters of it, but just something that gives us a sense about kind of what you've been up to that you'd like to share. And so with that, I'll hand it off to Qiaira.
I guess so while we were in the last semester, or while I was in my last semester at Moore, in the basement, there's a ceramic studio, and that had nothing to do with anything I was making or doing. I just needed something to distract me while I was writing this thesis that was really stressing me out. And so I like reignited my ceramics practice and just didn't know what to do with all these random ceramics. I got to make it more and get fired for free at more. And so Juneteenth, right after graduated, I had non-Black folks donate money to me so that I could give away all my ceramics for free to Black femmes. And that started this thing called Free Ceramics for Black femmes that I was just kind of randomly fell into. And sort of that random project I did has spiraled off into a bunch of grants where I get to teach free ceramic workshops to Black femmes, even though I'm not a ceramicist in a traditional sense. And that's led to a lot of cool money opportunities. I feel like a lot of people who in the MFA program, at some point you're introduced to cyanotypes. I got really into those. So I've taught free cyanotype workshops for Black femmes. And then recently I was given a residency from Fleischer and Leeway, essentially to combine the ceramics practice and the cyanotypes practice. And so that's been a cool experience. It's like that kind of random thing I was doing as an outlet has turned into grants and residencies, and grants turn into other grants. So money for art is very nice, and has been cool.
Thanks, Qiaira. That's great to hear. Chelsey, can I hand it off to you?
Yes, definitely. I struggled actually for a little bit as to what to do immediately after grad school, as everyone does, but especially because everyone was inside and completely alone and working in a social context that was a little bit of a temporary existential crisis. And so what I started really getting into is really embracing the virtual space. And I started doing kind of like Qiaira was saying, I started speaking at conferences and really working the conference circuit. Started with the Common Field Convening and then went from there and did a handful of other conferences since. And have also been working with receiving grants. And one of the things that really propelled me to do that was these projects that I was doing at Moore. Kristen Shaverdian, who was on one of the MA panels earlier today, her and I both had a dance background and were really into performance and were really interested in how we ethically and aesthetically show images of people in pain, or how we address difficult or uncomfortable conversations in ways that are safe and productive, and trying to hold a balance of both of these things. And so we started doing this guest lecture series at Moore, which Daniel helped us out to really get that started. And we started guest lecturing at a series of undergraduate classes. And so that became something that we started building workarounds and created scenes and started doing digital work. And aside not from those workshops, but with the graduating class in general, we did digital work on our exploration of our last semester. And this is a digital piece that we put on the Moore virtual thesis, morethesis.com. Check it out. And so I really started working more with digital work. But now that we can be in person again, Kristen and I are shifting back to in-person workshops, and we're going to be doing some of these this summer. But again, to go back to Tim's point, is creating a question that is generative and that you can work with for a long time. I'm still working with a lot of the research and a lot of the questions and answering them. And then that poses other sub questions. And then I try to answer those. And it's been very helpful for me.
Thanks, Chelsey. It's great hearing about that layered process. Tim, you want to take it?
When I graduated, there was a lot of questions. I made the choice to move back to Tennessee after I graduated, and there was a lot of questions about why I would do that. And I have been proven that I have had nothing but a lot of things to do since I've been back. One of those was in August of 2020. My entire family contracted COVID-19, and I was in the hospital for a week, almost a week and a half. My mother was in the ICU, and then a couple months later, my grandfather passed due to COVID. And living in the Southeast during the pandemic, just the cultural discourse around all of it was very tense, as it was all over the place, but particularly in this context, there was a lot of tension between how people thought that it should be handled, a lot of sickness and a lot of death. And Chattanooga was hit especially hard by the pandemic. And while I was in the hospital, I had conversations with nurses and doctors who were like in hazmat suits and across the room, and we're all in isolation, who had been, working multiple days straight and hadn't seen family and were really kind of at their wits' end, even at that point early on in the pandemic. And I had an opportunity when I got out and had a chance to recover to collaborate with the arts and healthcare program at the hospital where I was a patient. The director is actually a very dear friend of mine, and there was an opportunity to kind of lean into that program. One of its responsibilities is associate care or well-being, care and well-being for nurses and doctors and the staff of the hospital. So we together made a project where I created, I'm going to do a visual again because I like a good visual. Wrong button. We did a series of panels. The hospital had multiple campuses, and so there was this continuous image of a creek with rolling kind of rapids going through in the debris and boulders. And each of these panels, or a couple of them, were placed at different campuses of this hospital network in places of high traffic for the healthcare workers. And so in this one image there, it was literally right outside of the decontamination unit. And they were left for months, and the nurses and doctors were able to write their thoughts anonymously. And going back to my questions about credit, when you're in a hospital situation and you're dealing with like HIPAA laws and anonymity and like patient privilege and things like that, creating a space where the healthcare workers could just like vent or verbalize or commiserate or whatever. And the project grew and people kept contributing to it, and it turned into a memorial. There was one particular campus where when we pulled it off the wall, a bunch of these sticky notes fell out from behind where nurses had written that a patient had died. And it was just this little like memorial thing that happened. And that went from the conversation around healthcare to just kind of our community at large. And so, I'm the curator and education director for the Association of Visual Arts, which is a nonprofit arts organization in Chattanooga. And we had later an opportunity to collaborate on an exhibit between the gallery and the hospital. And we had an open call that went out to the entire kind of 2-hour radius around Chattanooga to artists who had been which we knew artists were making work in isolation to process their experiences. And we had noticed that there was really no outlet for it. And so we had this huge exhibit between both spaces of artists making work about grieving. Some of it was political cartoons. Some of it was, you can see the background. There's like a large wooden carving of a bandana, a burial quilt. There's paintings of people in isolation in their homes, like with their roommates. We had one person make an image of like, it was a relief carving of a Zoom call on their cell phone. So it was just all the different kind of experiences that people were having in the pandemic. And it was a really well attended and well received exhibit that had a lot of engagement and a lot of kind of the comments being that like, I'm really glad this is here because I have not been seeing this else. I've not been seeing this kind of processing elsewhere, and that it was helpful for people who were processing things on their own to see other people kind of working through it in a way that was not necessarily the news cycle or the like political discourse around it. So that's what I've been doing.
Thanks, Tim. And how about you, Huewayne? Can I hand it off to you?
So I'll just share really quickly because I think I kind of shared a bit, but I'll share the visual for the exhibition that sort of became an online exhibition, and I think it's a permanent digital space, but they put a lot of work into it. I'll say we, because we worked collectively, but it really was a graphic designer working with, right, the curator and me as guest curator, literally handling every single document that was viewed, is still being viewed, thinking about what would be digitized, what would be sort of left for posterity or for later research or projects, further research and projects by others, and you know, the tombstones and creating each and every sort of design that we brought out from the archive into sort of a space that people could engage, working through them for this particular exhibition and concerning the artists that I researched. So I can't say anything that, other than I did not anticipate all of this. So my advice would be to think broadly about all of what your projects may become, and just, I don't know, perhaps hold on to a collaborative approach, and definitely a sort of collective approach, especially given what's afforded already in what's been laid down in questions and thinking and scholarship in socially engaged art, right? I think there was so much already done for artists like, me, Tim, Qiaira, and Chelsey, to be able to take up our own questions and do more with. And I think this project would not have come about if, I hadn't engaged all of that sort of prior work and scholarship and performances and even practices that are hard to define, and projects that were hard to define, yet I still hold dearly, and artists such as, Merle Lederman Euclides, and how much work is required, but once that work is done, how appreciated it can be to engage all of that genealogy. So I came to write the definitions of ancestor that I needed, and they're broad and as extensive as how we engage the arts. So yeah, I'm just grateful, if anything else.
It's so cool to hear what you all have been up to. It's really exciting, and I mean, I can say from interacting with you when you were in school, there was like a similar range of sort of like a diversity of subject matter and approaches that made it really rich, to be around you and your, your peers. But then sort of similarly, I feel like that is continuing to expand with your practice afterwards. And so, just miss having those conversations with you all, but glad we could come back together today. And I think we can wrap up there.